and welcome to my channel. My name is Kate and today I'm going to be doing a wrap-up. I'm actually combining October and November because I never did an October wrap-up. I just got crazy busy. It never happened. And I only read 2 books in November, so it doesn't really make sense, I don't think, to make a separate video for those 2 books, so I'm just gonna talk about all of them. That might make this a little bit longer, but it shouldn't be too bad. Starting off with October, I have my handy TBR journal. This was the size of my October TBR because I'm a mad woman and I don't understand how time works, especially since I was going to be starting school at the end of the month. I thought I was going to cram in a bunch of books, and spoiler alert, no, I didn't. But I'll talk about the ones. I'm not going to get super into all of the ones I didn't get to. I will say I had 5 carryovers and I got to 0 of them. Just the worst record for that. Some of these I'm probably going to end up shifting because I'm going to need to reread them by the time I actually get around to reading them, so might as well just put them back on the TBR to read at some point later. I had 2 priorities. I made progress with one of them, was Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. I did not finish it. I also didn't finish it in November, so stay tuned for the December wrap-up where I will actually talk about my feelings on it. And then moving into the section where I actually finished some books was, of course, the MBR Might Be Read section. I ended up getting a copy of Blackwing, like, literally as soon as I finished watching Alan's review of it, and I'll just say that that one ended up being a 4-star read for me. I am going to have a dedicated review for Blackwing, and that will be coming out on Thursday. So if you want to see all of my thoughts on the I'll talk about the different compile categories there. But I really enjoyed it. I didn't love all of the characters, but if you're curious about my opinions on it, go see that review when it comes up. The other book from the MBR category that I finished in October was The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien. This one, I loved it so much. It was so good. I knew I was going to because this was a reread. I originally read The Two Towers back in March or April, I don't remember exactly. Loved it then. I still loved it this time. This time I was listening to the Andy Serkis audiobook instead of the Rob Inglis audiobook, and there are things that each does really well. Andy Serkis does amazing voices. He really invests a lot of emotion into what's happening, and I have always loved the Rohirrim. Well, always, whatever. I really only, prior to this year, only had familiarity with them from the movies, but they have a lot of, like, Celtic, British Isles vibes in the movies, and they really do remind me of kind of like a mix of like Beowulf culture with kind of horse lords, and I just eat it up. It's absolutely my thing, and I love it. There's still a fair amount of travel in Two Towers, but it doesn't have the same pacing issues that I had with Fellowship previously. But I still really love this one, and I actually enjoyed Treebeard and the Ents substantially more this time around because I knew what to expect in terms of it not moving as fast when they're hanging out with the Ents. So all around, I thoroughly enjoyed this reread. I would highly recommend the Andy Serkis audiobooks, with the caveat that I think Rob Inglis is better at singing the songs than Andy Serkis is. So I mean, you kind of just pick whichever one you want to go with. They're both fantastic. Then, in the category of things that were not on my TBR, but that I touched anyway, that is the books that were recommended for the school program that I'm in. They were kind of just general self-help, staying dedicated type of books. The first one that I read was Atomic Habits by James Clear. This is a really popular self-help book. Um, I ended up giving it 3 stars because Atomic Habits is very practical, but also a little on the preachy side to me. He does use some stories to illustrate his points, and he has a lot of takeaways, but it feels like a defined system he's selling to you, and not the self-help books that I enjoy are ones that give insights but aren't super preachy, and this one just to me rode that line a little bit too much. If you need help developing good habits and avoiding bad ones, I would still really recommend it because I think he has a lot of really great advice for that. It just wasn't one of my favorites. It was good. I liked it. It just wasn't a new favorite. And so I gave that one 3 stars, 3 out of 5 stars. Then, the other book that I read for school was Grit by Angela Duckworth, and I really liked this one. So, Grit is kind of her study of how perseverance and passion can combine to factor into success a lot more than innate talent, and that in general, people have this assumption that being talented at something is what determines how successful you are, when she kind of finds out that the talent helps you, but if you don't have the grit to stick through a lot of the more difficult periods that are required to really learn the skills, then it's not going to get you anywhere. You'll just be really talented at something that you've put no work into. So it was really kind of strangely pragmatically inspiring in terms of there are a lot of things I like doing that I'm not innately talented at, and sometimes it can be really frustrating to be one of the people who needs to put in a lot more work to be good at it. And I really honestly loved hearing that you need to put the work in if you want to be good at something, and that you don't need to be talented, it just means you need to put in more work. And like, that doesn't seem like it should be inspiring, but it really did help me feel more confident about these subjects that I love, but are going to require more work for me. So I would highly recommend it. If you want to get a sense of what the book is about, she does have a TED talk where she kind of gets into the subject for a couple minutes. And then if that's interesting to you, and I will put a link to that in the description, if that's interesting to you, then I definitely recommend checking out Grit because she kind of expands on that, has a lot of stories that illustrate the points that she's making. It's very easy to read. So of the self-help books that I have read, this is really high on my list of ones that I enjoyed and felt helpful to me. And so I ended up giving it 4 stars. Then, getting into the books that I picked up but were not on my TBR. The first one of those was a true crime story, and that is The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream by Dean Jobb, I think is how you say his last name. I'm not 100% sure on that. And this is a story about a doctor who was actually Canadian but was fairly active in England, kind of the UK in general, and who basically used his skills as a physician to hide the fact that he was poisoning a bunch of people. And it really gets into how he used the trust that was given to physicians, and specifically to male physicians, to take advantage of people who were poor, primarily women. In fact, I think entirely women. But mostly people who are poor or in desperate situations, where he would kind of act like he was helping them out, and then he was actually killing them. It does do some time jumping, so when the story starts, he kind of sets the scene of Victorian England, Canada, and the US, in terms of the medical field and in terms of Cream's early life. And then he kind of jumps forward to Cream's activity in England, which is where they finally started realizing that people were being poisoned, and that it was a doctor who was responsible. And then as Scotland Yard kind of starts figuring out, kind of getting on his trail, it jumps back to talk about how this pattern of poisoning was established like almost throughout his life. And so it does a bit of time jumping that can be a little disorienting. I think if you like true crime, kind of how someone goes from being a normal kid to ending up killing multiple people, this was pretty interesting for that. There's no defining moment where it's like, yeah, this dude's crazy. You just kind of see this arc of him having questionable behavior until eventually he just ends up poisoning people. Um, but I would definitely recommend it. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. Super easy to read. Like I said, it can get a little disorienting with the time jumps, but if you're into true crime, I definitely recommend it. Then, the last book that I will talk about for October, I read because I wanted a scary read on Halloween. This one was super short, so I ended up picking it up, and that was Horrorstor by Grady Hendrix. And I didn't love this. I wish I enjoyed it more. This was my first book by Grady Hendrix, and based on this, I'm mixed on continuing. I do have one of his other books. I'm never going to remember. Southern Book Club's Guide to something with vampires. I never remember the full title. I may or may not get to that because this was disappointing to me. I don't read a ton of horror, so just as a caveat, I am not a horror expert in any way whatsoever. I really enjoyed The Shining. I enjoyed The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. Horrorstor felt almost comedic in terms of tone, but also really gross. It kind of gave me Evil Dead vibes, but like dialed up to 11. And so the concept, the premise of Horrorstor is that you have this kind of IKEA knockoff in the Midwest and ends up experiencing a lot of kind of haunting events where you have employees that are getting texts that say help, and stuff gets moved around at night, and there's weird gross messes when they come in the morning, and they have to figure out what's happening before corporate comes in. So the manager and some of the employees basically come in after hours and are supposed to kind of watch the store and figure out what's happening. And I'll put up my Compile scores for this one to give kind of an idea of where I landed on this. The real kicker for me was the characters. A horror novel, so I'm not really sure if you're supposed to connect with any of the characters. Sometimes I do in horror novels, and sometimes I don't. The ones that I really love are ones where I can connect with them on some level. And the issue that I had with Horrorstor is that I didn't like any of them. I mean, occasionally they would have moments where they were sympathetic, but they were all kind of not great people. And I just couldn't identify with any of them. I do think that if you've ever worked in retail, you will feel at least a little bit of sympathy for some of them. But I just never really liked them, and that kind of hurt my enjoyment. And then the other thing that kind of hurt my enjoyment was that it's gross in places. Like I said, very Evil Dead in terms of like mucus and just gross stuff happening. And it kind of goes, I was expecting something more like The Shining, where you have this slow ramp up to haunting and kind of the sketchy stuff happening. And this goes from retail workers hating their jobs to crazy crap happening. And it just felt like too much to me. So I just really didn't love this. I think the atmosphere is good. It's very creepy, but it never really hit the vibe that I want from a horror, where I feel creeped out, but I'm kind of enthralled by it. This one I kept just checking for the end to see when it was going to be done. But I think that if you like kind of over-the-top horror, and if you are interested, like if you've worked in retail before and you kind of know those feelings, then I think this might appeal to you. It also is cool mixed media style, where they've got like little IKEA brochures almost for the different types of furniture that this store sells, and kind of weird slogans for them. So that part was definitely fun. So if this kind of sounds like an interesting thing, I think it's still worth checking out. It just unfortunately didn't hit the vibes that I wanted out of a horror, so I didn't end up enjoying it very much. I gave it a 2 stars out of 5. And so that is all that I managed to read in October, and then November was even less, which is fine. I knew it was gonna be because being in school, I knew that I would just be mood reading. There was going to be very little that I actually got done. And so what I ended up reading 2 books. The first was finishing the read along that I've been doing with the Lord of the Rings with Ryan and Klaus, and I'll link their channels down below. And I loved this. I loved Return of the King when I read it the first time in March. This one, man, Circus really knows how to invest emotion into these stories. I absolutely love Return of the King. It felt comforting and it enthralling, but not quite as much as the first time I read it because I knew what was coming. So some of the moments that brought me to tears the first time I read it were now kind of just this comforting, like living in the world building feeling. So I still would definitely give this 5 stars, 6 stars if I'm stretching my rating system to indicate my favorites. But I really feel like Lord of the Rings is not going to be for everybody, but I feel like if you're a fantasy fan, you should at least give it a shot. You don't have to love it to be a fantasy fan. I hate gatekeeping with that, but I think it's worth trying. And then the other book that I finished was actually an anthology, which was the Mythic Dream, that is edited by Dominik Parisien and Navah Wolf. It has a ton of authors I absolutely love, and there are a number of stories in here, so I'm not going to talk about every story, but I'll kind of just point out some of the ones that I really loved. And some of these were from authors I was already familiar with, and then I was really kind of surprised to find a number of authors that I guess I should have been surprised that I now have on my TBR or higher on my TBR because I just loved the story that they wrote for this collection. The general theme for the Mythic Dream is that they're taking standard myths and kind of revamping them. So in the introduction, they say, "We asked our authors to filter classic myths through their dreamy minds, to parse their private lives, their imagination, the world around them, and to bring all these elements they've absorbed consciously and unconsciously to their narratives." And I think they did, overall, in this collection, they hit that. A lot of these were ones I was familiar with because a number of them are based on Greek myths. There were definitely some that I wasn't as familiar with, but overall I think it was just a great anthology. I ended up giving this 4 stars out of 5 because what I did is I rated each story out of 5 and then averaged it to figure out where I landed on that. So some of the ones that I really loved, one of them was Fisherbird by T. Kingfisher, and this, I've had T. Kingfisher on my TBR for a long time, and this really encouraged me to really start reading some of Kingfisher's stuff because it was so good. She basically retells the labors of Hercules from the viewpoint of a fisherbird who ends up helping out Hercules, and it's kind of set, it feels like it's set in the South in the United States. It kind of is set in a swamp, and it's kind of that standard American myth style where it's basically talking about there's this feature that an animal has, and it's describing how the animal came to have that feature. In this case, it's the stripe across the kingfisher's belly, which she gets from helping Hercules. But the humor in this, I ate it up, and I loved the voice for Kingfisher was just so appealing. She was kind of like standard Southern gentle or Southern lady, just kind of being helpful, but also kind of teasing. I absolutely loved it. It was one of the ones that I ignored my rating system and gave 6 out of 5, which may have skewed my results a little bit, but I loved it so much. Um, then one of the other ones I really liked was Curses Like Words, Like Feathers Like Stories, which was by Kat Howard. This was my first story by Kat Howard. It's a take on the Children of Lear Irish myth, and I loved the imagery. It really felt. I went to Ireland 2 years ago, I think, and this really made me feel like I was back there, and it has a lot to do with family ties and kind of the families we make for ourselves, and I just loved it. It was so good. Next one I really enjoyed was Across the River by Leah Cypress. I had never even heard of Leah Cypress. Unlike a lot of these others that I really liked, this was one I was not familiar with this author at all, and she took a Jewish myth, which is the legend of Rabbi, I may not say this right, but Rabbi Meir and the Sabbatean. And this, I just loved it. It's kind of a darker myth because it's talking about the oppression of the Jews. I think it's set in Germany, and kind of about how it's a David and Goliath type story where this young Jewish man basically has to defend the village against this sorcerer who goes around and specifically tries to hunt down Jews and touches them, and they basically fall ill and die. He's previously taken out whole villages, and it's kind of how he deals with that. And I loved that the main character used intelligence and kind of cleverness in fighting this sorcerer. I just appreciate when it's not about skill necessarily, it's not about strength, it's about being smart. And that really appealed to me. The last one that I will talk about, which I will probably not pronounce correctly, Florilegia, or Some Lies About Flowers by Amal El Motar. And this was really, really good. It was tackling the story of, which I think is a Welsh myth, Blodeuwedd, and that was so good. It was so beautifully written. I was really impressed by it because it really gets into kind of the language of the flowers. This myth deals with a woman who is kind of created out of plants in order to be the wife of this mythic figure who basically cannot be killed. And it's kind of about her struggles to figure out how to survive being suddenly moving from being a plant to being a person and being wholly under the control of her husband, basically, and kind of how she deals with that and how she finds ways to find herself. And I thought it was spectacularly done. So that one I absolutely loved. And then the real last one that I'm going to talk about, and mostly I rated this 4 out of 5, but I was deeply impressed because I have never had an author take a Sumerian myth, turn it into a space opera, and completely sell me on it. And that is Labatu Takes Command of the Flagship Heaven Dwells Within by Arkady Martine. Again, this is another one that was like, okay, I need to push Memories of Empire higher up on my priority list because it was so clever. It really incorporated the myth itself. She actually pulls lines from the myth, and then to make it a space opera with a very ferociously unapologetic main character was just beautifully done. I was very impressed by it, and I definitely want to check out more by Arkady Martine. It is, as a warning, if you pick up this collection, one of the more racy and cursing centric stories. So if neither of those things are your thing, you may not enjoy this story as much as I did. Um, but like I said, those were ones that I absolutely loved. I actually had a couple authors that I expected to enjoy their stories more, but because I had such a long list of stories that I loved, including from authors I wasn't as familiar with, I ended up really enjoying this. I am not going to be doing a compile rating because, I mean, it's collection of stories. You can't really make that work. But like I said, this was a 4-star read for me, one of the best anthologies in terms of my overall enjoyment of the collection as a whole, one of the best that I've read. I am definitely going to be picking up Starlit Wood, which is another collection edited by these same two editors. I have previously read Robots vs. Fairies, which is good, but I don't think it had, like, on balance, I didn't love as many of the stories in Robots vs. Fairies, but it still has some very good ones in it. So if you liked Mythic Dream, I would definitely recommend at least checking that one out from the library. Um, and by the way, thanks to Evie and Angela for making me aware of this collection, because I was so pleased with it. Now, this wrap up, dual month wrap up, has ended up longer than I had originally planned, but I'm long winded. What can I say? Uh, Let me know what you read in the month of October and November if we haven't already talked about it. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next one.